All right, what's up, guys? So the last time I left off talking about, in the last video I covered the first half of the Spartans' history, doing that brief rundown from 750-ish to like 431, what we mark as the beginning of the Peloponnesian Wars, or in the Spartans' eyes, the Athenian Wars, which I've said I'll call them the Athenian Wars because in the eyes of the Spartans, they were the wars fought against Athens. So, they wouldn't call them the Spartan Wars or the Peloponnesian Wars. They're called the Peloponnesian Wars by history because the Spartans were Peloponnesian, headed the Peloponnesian League. Thus, from an Athenocentric lens, which is what history has been told through, or at least Greek history, it's seen as the Spartan conflict or the Peloponnesian conflict, the Peloponnesian War. So, anyway, that said, I'll call it the Athenian Wars. But that's basically where we pick up. So the last thing I think I talked about was the Battle of Tanagra, which happened right around there. Was the last thing I talked about. Happens in 457 BC, right after the Messenian conflict or the Messenian slave revolt. The Helots, or a large portion of them, get released, set free. The Athenians actually, I think I left this out in the last video. The Athenians actually settle them in a new town called, I think it's now Pactus, which is, I think, like on the other side of the Corinthian Gulf, so on the other side of the Peloponnesus. But anyway, they settled them in their new home, which is part of the reason that it's a huge impetus for the Battle of Tanagra and why the Spartans take so hostilely toward the Athenians, who they've never liked anyway, basically, bottom line. I think I covered that in the last video, but the Spartans and the Athenians have always been inimical toward one another. They've always been ideologically very different. They've just really never had open conflict break out. There have been a couple instances, but this is where it really comes to a head and it gets really nasty. And so, all that aside, what's basically been going on since the end of the Persian Wars is that Athens has been building what amounts to an empire. So, in the very immediate aftermath of the Persian Wars, all of the Greeks are worried that the Persians could come back again, which is was a very real fear for them at the time. Persia's mighty. Like, even though they got their ass whooped by the Greeks, they easily could have come back again if they wanted. I mean, you're talking about a superpower, the likes of Rome, or what Alexander's empire maybe was for a minute, or like the British Empire way later on, America today. Like, you're talking about a power that can just come and come and come and just continue to come back just because they have that many resources basically to fund themselves. The thing with Persia at this point is they've failed 3 times. So they're not really going to be intent on coming back a fourth. And the third expedition, the one where we, Thermopylae and Salamis and all that, that's where their ass really gets handed to them on a silver platter. There was the instance of Marathon before that, 10 years previously in 490. And then even before that, the one that's lesser known by history is the one in 492, where Persia sends a fleet and a land army that, long story short, gets destroyed and doesn't even get to Greece. So they failed 3 times. They're probably not going to be intent on coming back a fourth time. It's just it's just too much of a nuisance, really. We know it took Xerxes and his father before him, Darius, like 6 years, at least 4, maybe as many as 6 years, just to prepare the invasion. So logistically, big deal. They're probably not going to come back. I always fear going into too much detail with backstories, but it's still a legitimate concern for the Greeks that they could come back, even if it's unlikely. And one thing that happens in the aftermath of the Persian Wars too is that the Athenians by sea continue to pursue the Persians and kind of continue to engage them in various naval combats and kind of keep beating them. And then there are some Persian victories too, but they do kind of keep their foot on the throats of the Persians. So there's maybe, in a way, not too much reason to expect that the Persians will come back, but it's still a legitimate concern. And so that said, the reason that legitimate concern is so important is the Athenians go about setting up this thing called the Delian League. It's called the Delian League because it was housed on the island of Delos, which is a sacred home to Apollo. That's why it's called the Delian League. That's where the treasury was, and treasury because it was a mutually funded league, or basically you could kind of call it a confederacy, where Athens brought into her power, we'll just say, these various polis, these city-states from around Greece. Most of them were island nations. Again, because I referenced Athens' navy, and that was her whole key to success. That's how she was able to play her part against the Persians in the Persian Wars, was through her navy. She's a naval power. Sparta is a land power, right? So the basic delineation between the two is land power, naval power. So basically, most of these states that Athens is bringing into the league are island nations. So there's like 3,000 islands in the Aegean Sea. Some are bigger, more important than others, but there's the Greece is a bunch of mountains and a bunch of islands basically. So they're just kind of sailing around, like incorporating all these different states into their power. And then there's coastal areas too. The coastal areas are the other. It's basically anything they can access by sea. They're not going inland because that's not their wheelhouse. That's not their game. So they're anywhere that their ships can touch. That's what they're bringing in to their power. Is another word I'm looking for, but bringing into their power. And the legitimization behind it is that they say that, okay, like we're setting up this confederacy so that if Persia comes back, we'll have, and like all you guys need to contribute to this mutual, piggy bank on the island of Delos. That way, if the Persians come back, we'll have the funds to repel them. So that's the basis for the league. What happens is that over the course of decades, because there are 50 years, there's a half century between the end of the Persian Wars and the beginning of the Athenian Wars. And in that time, whether there's an interesting discussion to be had as to like whether the Delian League really starts out as something benevolent and well-intentioned. It doesn't really matter. Like, I would say probably so, but there's plenty of reason to be skeptical. But bottom line, what happens is it turns into more than a confederacy. It turns into an Athenian empire. And there are some instances that, just for the sake of time, I can't really go into, but there are a couple of instances where Athens either puts a city to the sword, and if they didn't put the women and children to the sword, then they were enslaved. I forget the specifics, but where they put the city to the sword, because the inhabitants either refuse to accept Athenian hegemony, basically, or they rebel. The Athenians just literally, it's almost like the way the Romans would put it down, just by the sword. And then there are some other instances that immediately precipitate the wars, the war between Athens and Sparta, like right in 432, 431, immediately precipitating them. That really is the precipitation for like the final precipitation, the final thing that sets Sparta on the path to declare war against Athens. And that's what ends up happening in 431, trying to bring this full circle, is that Sparta has sat back for 50 years and watched Athens build this empire. And this is where, again, for the sake of time, it's tricky to try to go down this road. The whole kind of premise behind Sparta's way of existence, just like what she did, was very not laissez-faire. Not that's not the right term, but it's not necessarily that they were hands-off. They were very autonomous. They were very much about the mentality of, you do you, we'll do us. Like, you don't need to talk to us, we won't talk to you. Putting it very loosely in sort of colloquial terms, as we would, like, they just weren't really very concerned with anybody else, what anybody else was doing. So they just kind of let Athens do her thing. They're like, we don't really want to bother with it. Like, and I think in the back of their minds, they're sitting there watching it all these decades long, saying, oh boy, this isn't good. I'm sure they could see what was happening. Like, I have no doubt about it. But they just let it go, because ultimately it's not their business. They're trying to, that's the whole, just way behind their lifestyle. They get called xenophobic. I'm not going to call them xenophobic. They're just isolationists. Like, and even that's a little too strong of a term, but they are isolationists. They just like, they don't really want to have anything to do with anybody else. And they're just like, leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. And that ends up kind of biting them in the ass, because 50 years later, they finally understand, oh crap, we're next. They basically, whether it's an assumption or a realization, whatever you want to call it, they believe that Athens is going to come for them next. That after Athens has basically conquered the whole of Greece, which, who knows, I mean, maybe it takes another 50 years, but that it's going to happen. They can tell that what Athens is doing is intentionally and strictly trying to be the hegemon of Greece. And they just believe it's only a matter of time before the Athenians are on their very doorstep in Laconia, invading them, and they're going to be the last man standing. And no matter how strong they are, they understand they can't fight the world. They couldn't fight Persia on their own. The only reason that they beat Persia was because they had the help of the rest of Greece. They are mighty to a man. This is what has to be understood about the Spartans. They're mighty to a man, but they're still a small nation ultimately. I mean, you're talking about at this point in history, I'm going to be just generous. Like the most we ever know that their citizen body stands at, their citizen soldier body stands at, is like 9,000. So we could be generous and round up and say 10,000 is probably a fair figure, because based on the other figures of militaries in Greece, we know that nobody really had more than 10,000 guys as a standing force. Athens had about 10,000, and they're still, like, numerically by population, the biggest city, and pretty much always were in Greece. So none of these states, none of these armies are particularly big, and Sparta included. Like, she just can't fight the world. So she knows that if it's going to be Athens and the rest of Greece against her, it's done. It's over. There's going to be no fight. Even if they try to hold, and pull up Thermopylae, and hold to the last man, it's going to be futile. They know that, and that's a great insight with the Spartans, that they're not stupid, and they don't. There's this kind of misconception about them based on Thermopylae, that they'll just always fight to the last man. Like, yeah, yes and no. Like, they're only going to do that if the situation is right and calls for it, and they're not trying to put themselves in a situation where they need to fight the rest of Greece with Athens at the head. And they know how powerful Athens is, so they're not getting it twisted. So they basically believe right now is the time to act. Now, this is all kind of a long explanation as to how we get into the Athenian Wars, but it's super important, because it's I'll go ahead and say this. This is going to be what's going to shape the rest of Greek history, and in a way the rest of world history. It's a super, in-depth, fascinating conversation to go into. The world changes at this point. At this point in history, Greece and then the world over changes with this conflict. It might not make any sense. I can't really go into it because we're already at 12 minutes. But this is a monumental moment. It's the moment that Sparta begins to fall. That's ultimately going to be Athens' fall. It's going to be the fall of the entirety of Greece. It's going to be what's going to open the door for Philip and ultimately Alexander of Macedon to conquer Greece and then conquer the world and change world history. This is a big moment, and it starts with Athenian hubris, with Athenian empire building, and Sparta is left with no choice but to declare war. And that's what we get in 431, is the decision in the assembly to make this absolutely historically world-changing decision to go to war. And that's what happens. And there are a few instances from the backstory that I left out, but ultimately it's the Athenian aggression, the Athenian hubris and empire building that leads Sparta to declare this war. They just feel in jeopardy. They're very scared that, if they don't act now, there will be no acting. Whether you want to be on the side of the Spartans or not, these are the facts. This is the truth, and this is what leads them to declare war from their mindset. And that's always what I'm trying to do, is give you more than the facts. I'm trying to take you back into their mindset, into the people themselves, and kind of have us be able to see what they saw. From the Spartans' point of view, agree or not, they don't think they think this is, what am I trying to say? That the time is now. That if they don't act now, it will be too late, basically. That it's now or never. That's the saying I'm looking for. They think it's now or never. So they act, they do the only thing they know to do, and the war starts. So the war starts, and basically most of the conversation, honestly, is about the kind of the precipitation of the war, because once the war starts, not a whole hell of a lot happens. Sort of. I mean, I shouldn't say that. But a lot of what the initial stages of the war involve is Sparta besieges Athens. She marches into Attica, the surrounding territory of Athens, and just pretty much burns the crops, chops down all the trees, olive trees. Olives are, were and always have been, still are a major crop in Greece. What's the word? Like a staple. And they just pretty much raise everything. The reason it becomes a stalemate is because, so this is where it becomes important that I mentioned that Athens had an empire. She can just basically import grain and whatever the hell else she needs from all over the world, kind of like her empire, all the way to the Black Sea, all around the Aegean, into Asia Minor, yada yada. So they're not really strapped. They're not really wanting for anything. The Spartans can burn the produce and the grain, all day that they want in Attica, and at the end of the day, Athens is still going to have whatever they need to subsist on. They're just this is where we start talking about, like I mentioned, nations like Persia and Rome and Macedon and his empire under Alexander and the British Empire, America, all those, like, it's money. These guys have money to just spend like it's nobody's business, and they just have resources like it's nobody's business. So there's not much. The Spartans are kind of trying to starve them out of Athens and trying to draw them into a pitched battle, because that's what they want. That's their strong suit. They can beat anybody and pretty much will beat anybody in a face-to-face conflict. In fact, later on, there is one instance in the Athenian Wars where Athens actually offers Sparta pitched combat, and they do lose. Athens doesn't want to offer pitched combat because she basically knows she's going to lose. It's not. I mean, this is pretty much like Athens knows. Let's talk about Sparta having her game in her wheelhouse. That she's a land force and wants to draw the Athenians into pitched battle. Well, the Athenians are naval power, so they don't want to play that game. See, each wants to play their game, and the Athenians can afford to sit behind their walls. Fun as not fun as it might be, or fun as it might not be. They can afford to sit behind their walls and just kind of wait it out. Like, they're not really. It's like whatever for them. They're just like, all right, keep doing your thing out there. We'll be in here chilling, So they can get away with it, and they basically do. It's funny because the thing that kills the Athenians is, like, it's crazy. It's like an accident. It's just total. Well, you wouldn't call it coincidence because we think that we do know why what happened. A plague hits Athens in the first year of the war, so they're kind of like, sitting in there, and you guys can't, you can't touch us, and the Spartans are out there probably pissed off because they can't get to them, and they, y'all come fight us, and they won't come fight. And it's kind of a stalemate. And then somewhere in that first, maybe into the second year of the conflict, that plague strikes Athens, and it is horrendous. Without like sparing details, basically, like, I think the statistic is that a third of the entirety of the population of Athens dies. A third. Men, women, children, slaves. I think it's the entirety of the population. It wipes them out. And what's funny is it doesn't kill them. It is a monumental blow, and it's going to play into the rest of the war. So the plague being considered, there are a lot of the plague's still going on, and it's kind of a testament to just how secure Athens is. Like, it still doesn't destroy them. They don't surrender. It's a monumental blow, but it doesn't kill them. And the war kind of goes on. And then what happens is we start getting a lot of proxy wars going on around Greece. So we have a conflict that develops at Potidaia up in the north, where they besiege. Potidaia is like a stronghold for Athenian timber, where they build their ships and get a lot of their supplies from. There's a siege of Plataea at one point that's near Athens. So there's kind of a lot of, like, the Spartans can't actually do anything in Athens. So then you start getting the development of these kind of like proxy conflicts going on around in the rest of Greece. And that's what a lot of the war consists of. There's so many like different mini instances, and I'm trying to be broad and kind of use sweeping strokes here. But one of the major, so I don't want to miss anything, but one of the major instances that we have from the first half, by the way, there are two halves of the war. We call the first one in history the Archidamian War, because Archidamos was one of the two kings of Sparta who basically led the principal part. He basically led the first half for Sparta of the war. So we call it the Archidamian War, like, historically, but names don't really matter, whatever. In that first half of the war, one of the most famous instances is the instance of Sphacteria, and this is like. This one's gonna like require a video unto itself, so I will try to brush over it without brushing over it, because it's hard to, you can't really brush over it. It's super important. Sphacteria is, if you guys are familiar with it, it's kind of a naval / land battle. It's a naval battle that turns into a land battle that turns into basically a siege. Not the siege of a city, but a group of Spartans with I think there are Perioikoi and Helots with them. There's, I forget the number, I think 120 Spartiates, actual full-blooded, like military caste Spartans. They get stranded on the island of Sphacteria. We're talking about the southwestern Peloponnese, so near Pylos, where wise Nestor in the Iliad was from. So that's kind of where we're at. And long story short is the Spartans, like, I think it's 120 of them, get stranded on Sphacteria. It's this little island off, like kind of off the coast of Pylos, sort of. And it turns into a siege. They're stranded. They don't really have any food. They don't have any water. They're stranded, and the Athenians kind of put them to the siege. The long story short, that's why I said I'd try to brush over this. The Spartans end up surrendering, and that's why the instance is so major. So there's a lot to say about Sphacteria. That's why I said I need to just do a video about it unto itself. You can go all kinds of ways and talk about it from all different angles, but it shakes the Greek world. The Greece, especially after what they saw at Thermopylae, thinks that the Spartans will never surrender, and I'm not going to go into it, but it says a lot. But it is a major turn. It shakes the Spartans too. It shakes their own mentality, and those Spartan prisoners. I'm not sure if any of them get killed at all. I don't think any of them die, but at least most of them, I think, all get taken prisoner, and they're prisoner in Athens. They are prisoners in Athens until, I think it's for the next 5 years, until the peace is finally declared in 421, I think, which is 4 years. So about a handful of years later, there's a peace that's finally declared, and those. It's funny because those Spartans who are taken hostage actually are a big impetus for the peace on the Spartan side. I talked from the very beginning about how the entirety of the war is just a stalemate for both sides. Nobody can really gain any traction, gain an upper hand, because it goes back to what I mentioned about the two sides having different strong suits. They do different things, and so neither one can really reel the other into their trap, so to speak. Like the Spartans can't get the Athenians in a land battle. The Spartans can't get the Athenians to fight them on land. The Athenians can't really beat the Spartans on sea because they don't really have a navy, so to speak. Of they'll get one, and they're maybe just starting to, but they don't really have a navy, so there's not like a lot to say there. The Athenians do a lot of ravaging, a lot of raiding of the coastline of Laconia and any of her, probably of Messenia too, anything under Spartan control, and other Peloponnesian allies that are allied to her. So that's a lot of what Athens tactics. Athens tactics are very similar to the Spartans. It's the same idea of like not pillage, but pretty much burn everything. Like Sparta goes into Athens and burns everything. Athens sails along the coastline of Laconia and burns everything. It's just a stalemate. Like nobody can really gain an upper hand. There's a little more to it than that, but it's just a stalemate. And so by 421, I think is the year officially. It's just stalemated. They're playing, as we say, tap dance, and nobody can gain an upper hand. And from the Spartans' point of view, their numbers are an important thing to talk about. Is that their numbers are starting to diminish from the conflict and just possibly other various reasons. But they need those 120 Spartiates who get captured. They really need them. They really want them back, and it testifies to the strength and to the value of just one of those guys. And so there finally is a peace that's declared in, again, I think 421, which lasts all of, depending on how you look at it, I think 3 years. And the war basically starts back up with the Battle of Mantinea, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, but didn't give it a name. That's the one time where Athens offers Sparta their pitched combat. Barring like the specific logistics of the battle, the outcome is a Spartan victory, a decisive Spartan victory, but not decisive in the sense of anything really being decided from it. It's just decisive in not being unclear. It's clearly a Spartan victory, but there's really not much fallout from it. As we see through the course of the war, it takes a lot to kill Athens. She had so much money, so many resources, so many states under her protection or dominion, so much help. Like it by the end, it's a wonder Sparta is able to kill her. Honestly, I don't know if killer is the right word, but it's a wonder almost that Athens does lose in the end. I'm spoiling the plot. Sorry, I think you guys probably know that Athens loses in the end. It takes so much for them to get killed. So one defeat on land, it's not like their land forces get annihilated. I mean, they lose. I don't honestly remember the numbers of casualties on either side, but it doesn't do much. But it is, I will say this about Mantinea, it is a massive morale swing for the Spartans. That's what it is. So it's less about the kind of immediate, like tangible things that the battle produces, and more about, it's more the unseen, the morality, the not the morality, but the morale that swings back in the Spartans' favor. Because after Sphacteria, their morale was like devastated, and the entire Greek world like doubted them. They're like, you guys surrendered? You guys are never supposed to surrender. And there are reasons for it and all that, but I said I'm not going to go into it. Bottom line is, the world and Sparta herself is shaken from that defeat, and Mantinea puts the wind back in their sails. It's like I said, decisive victory. They get the battle they wanted this whole time, and they do, we can say they whip that ass. So it puts the wind back in their sails. It puts them back in kind of the mindset of, okay, we got this, we can do this. That's the only like major, you would say, fallout from Mantinea. And then after Mantinea, basically the next major episode to occur, and this is a major one, so I can't really go into it, but the next major episode to occur in the war is what's called the Sicilian expedition. And Athens basically takes this strategy where she thinks that if she can capture the island of Sicily, which you guys probably know where that is, it's below the boot of Italy, so it's significantly to the west, especially for them back then, not having like modern transportation and communications and stuff. It's, I think, like 1,000 miles to the west. It's significantly further west. Like, they didn't really deal with the Sicilians and the Italians on a regular basis. They had colonies over there and whatnot, but it's the point is, it's significantly far away. So for the Athenians to endeavor to do this, it's a big gamble. And there's a lot of debate in the Athenian assembly about whether they want to do this or not. But ultimately, Alcibiades is one of the major statesmen and generals in Athens at the time. He's able to persuade them. So I'm already going into detail, but they do end up undertaking the expedition, and long story short, it blows up in their face, like 100%. Just, it is a disaster for them. They lose, I forget the amount of men. I'm not going to tell you because I'm going to stumble on the number, but they lose about 100 ships. I do know that much. They lose like 100 ships, and their whole navy is something like 300 ships strong, something like that. So I want to tell you how many men they lost. I can't remember. It's in the tens of thousands, I believe. Whatever it is that they send to Sicily, they lose the entirety of it. Literally, and I mean literally, no one comes back except maybe like some random straggler who was able to catch a piece of driftwood. Like, nobody comes back. The only survivors are actually caught and kept in some miserable, I think a mine, which is like basically one of the worst fates you could get in the ancient world. Have to go to work in these mines. Like it's like 8,000 or something. Like, nobody gets back home. So it is a disaster for the Athenians, and that's a lot of what does propel the Spartans to end up winning. It's, the war is not decided there, which is a further testament to how strong the Athenians were. Even that by all rights should have killed them, didn't. They came back to Athens, or no, they regrouped in Athens, dug into their treasuries in the Parthenon, and just rebuilt everything. I mean, just literally rebuilt it again, from scratch almost. And they did successfully, and they went back and fought valiantly again. They had so many resources, it's ridiculous. This is how much it took to destroy them. The Sicilian expedition should have destroyed them. It didn't. And there's a lot of credit due to their morale too. Like, I mean, this is a people that had, hand in hand with the Spartans, defeated the Persians, and they have a lot of pride, and so like they believe they could do anything the same way the Spartans did. But they are able to rebuild themselves, but I will say, it is still a major blow. It's something that in a way you never recover from, because even if you rebuild, you're still lacking, like say you build 200 more ships or 100 more, you're still lacking the 100 that you lost. It's a major blow, and they don't ever quite recover from it. So that's in 415. The expedition, I believe, fails in 411. From there, we have like 7 more years to the end of the conflict. And at that point, basically, I think, as I keep saying, the long story short of this is another major turn in the war. And so I talk about how Athens rebuilds. The reason it's important to talk about Athens rebuilding her navy, her land army to some extent. It's particularly her navy, because that's again her wheelhouse. The Spartans are kind of like sitting in Laconia, like, what the hell do we have to do here to beat these people? it's kind of getting demoralizing for them. Of course, that wasn't so much a Spartan-inflicted victory or defeat for the Athenians, isn't really a self-inflicted one, but still, they're sitting there like, that didn't kill them? What's going to kill them? So the Spartans are kind of like, crap, this isn't good. I'm trying to think how to say it, but what ends up happening is the Athenians kind of, again, gain the upper hand. Despite that whole disaster, they strike some naval victories over the Spartans, and Spartans, it's so kind of dire for them at this point. They need, like, they can't play the game they want to play. They just want to get the Athenians in open combat and just kill them, which they got at Mantinea, but like I said, it's not decisive enough to end the war. So maybe they need a couple of those opportunities, but that's what they want, and they can't get that opportunity. So they're kind of left with no choice but to try to beat them on sea. Problem is, they don't have a navy. So what do they do but enlist the aid of Persia to help them financially, or to finance a fleet? And so this is a major point that we get in history talking about what happens. I mean, they turn to Persia, of all people. Persia still has a lot of influence in Asia Minor. It's like I talked about in the beginning. Like, they were defeated, but they weren't really defeated. Like, they're still powerful. They're still around. They could come back to Greece easily if they wanted. They're just probably sick and tired of trying. They still got just as much money and men as ever. And the Spartans, just, again, it's kind of an analysis unto itself. People are always going to say, oh, that's turncoat. It's treasonous. Treasonous to Hellas, basically. Maybe. I mean, I'm not going to really get into it, but that's what they do. The idea is they don't really have a choice. It's either they're so strapped for money, for men, strapped for morale, for everything. They're up against the ropes, kind of. They don't really have an option. It's a dilemmatic and a really screwed up situation for them. They just don't really have. They're out of their element. Is the best way I can describe it. Like, they are not able to fight a war based on the people they are. They're being sucked into a new element, and the only thing they can do is somehow get. Because you got to remember, one really important thing to remember about Sparta is that, like, they do and they don't. So this is a tricky point. They don't really have money. Like, they're not a. When I say that, they're not an economically driven peoples. They basically, I'm not an economist, they basically have what they need to make their state function. Like, they don't really have, again, I'm not an economist, so I'm probably just going to end up stepping on my damn self, but they don't have the kind of funds to fund, like, 200 ships. They just don't. Like, they don't. They have their kleroi, where the Spartans get their produce from to contribute to the common messes and pay their agogay fees and stuff like that. They're a simple people. They don't operate, like, they don't do things like build fleets. They don't build Parthenons. They don't have this kind of money. And to build a fleet like they have to have money, and they don't have it. They just don't. Their world is just not set up that way. It's not a matter of, like, it's just not set up that way. So they really don't have a choice. So they do enlist the aid of Persia financially, and that turns the war. As concisely as I can say it, that turns the war. Persian money in the end enables Sparta to strike victories on sea against the Athenians, which is kind of astounding. And it does speak a lot to the Spartans' ability to adapt, because they did ultimately have to execute those victories. But they do, in the end, end up being able to strike the Athenians on sea. And they suffer some big defeats as well at the hands of the Athenians. One at Arginusae. There's another one, I think it starts with an N that I can't recall. But they do finally, in the very end, gain the victory they need at Aegospotami. And that is... Aegospotami and Arginusae, I think, are both off the northwest coast of Asia Minor. If it puts it in the perspective geographically for you, it doesn't matter too much. But long story short, under and this is a video to talk about unto himself. This guy named Lysander. Lysander is one of the most important figures. I haven't even talked about him yet, but he's one of the most important figures for Sparta during the Athenian Wars. He becomes their admiral, who ultimately leads them to victory on the sea. And his story is interesting. I don't have time to talk about it, but he's what's called a Mothax. He was basically like an illegitimate child who had his way paid in two. So I forget the specifics surrounding his birth, if he had maybe one legitimate Spartan parent or none. He wasn't a helot, but he's someone who's not really supposed to be in the Agogé, and somebody pays his fees to basically become a Spartan, to enroll in the Agogé and go through it so that he can become a Spartiate. So he has been through the Agogé, but he starts out as a Mothox, which is kind of an interesting part of his story, since he does go on to such glory. But he's the one who leads the Spartans to victory, and he is a character, along with Cleomenes is one of the most fascinating characters in the Spartans' history, which is like 100 years before this, back before the Persian Wars. Of course, Leonidas. Agesilaus is actually a contemporary of Lysander. Lysander, and though I'm listing some of the most intriguing characters we have from their history, Lysander is one of them. Brasidas I haven't even talked about Brasidas, but he is another monumental figure for the Spartans. I skipped over him, really. He's commanding around the time of Sphacteria. This is why it's so hard to hit all the details in our quick rundown like this. But he's another monumental figure, as important, at least as important as Lysander. He's kind of like a good, true, blue-blooded Spartan, sort of. But I skipped over him. But he and Lysander are probably the two most important names from the Athenian Wars, and it's ultimately Lysander. Brasidas dies. He is actually, to backtrack just a little bit, he is a big impetus for the initial peace that's declared in 421. It's with his death that the Spartans sue for peace, because they're like, oh crap, man, our guy just died, we've got prisoners taken, we're like, oh, we gotta have peace. And the Athenians want peace just as much. But that's to backtrack and talk about Brasidas. He's a major figure, and then Lysander is the other one, and it's Lysander. I'm jumping all over the place, I know, I'm trying to keep it straight, but Lysander, at the end of all things, is the figure for the Spartans who is able to bring them the victory that they've been seeking for basically 3 decades. It's 27 years from start to finish. I mean, that's a generation, if you can picture that. It's crazy. There's kind of a famous scene from Thucydides where he sails into the harbor of Athens, into the Piraeus, and they have to surrender. And so that's it, guys. I'm pretty sure my camera's gonna run out on me here in a minute, but that's like the entirety of the Athenian Wars from start to end. 27 years long, and there's a lot that I left out that I'm sure you guys you'll find something. Those of you who already know about the history and are insightful, you'll see something that I left out, just like I left out Brasidas. But that's the entirety of it, of the wars, and there's just so much more to talk about because it's so monumental. I'm going to try to cut this off because I swear my camera's going to cut me off if I don't shut up. And I'm going to I was hoping I would get this done in 2 installments, but I think I'll probably need one more to kind of finish up the last period of the Spartans' history and their hegemony before they kind of fall into ruin. So I'll wrap it up there. I know that's kind of cutting it off quick after all the elaboration I did, but that's basically the Athenian Wars, start to end, and it's a major period. Again, it's 3 decades long. It's a whole segment of their history just within one conflict. So a lot more to talk about there. You guys can always hit me up on IG or whatever and ask me any questions you want. But I'll end there. We end in like 404 is the year that the Spartans officially win the war, and then we move on to our next segment after that. Okay, peace, guys.